Now all my employees want in on that damn Americans with Disabilities Act.
Hank, you cannot stand by while these greedy pigs suck the life out of Strickland propane. Anybody's disabled if you think hard enough.
You see, after the passing and enforcement of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, in 1990, a lot of the media coverage surrounding it, both in news journalism directly covering court cases surrounding it, and in fictional media discussing it, both sell a very specific kind of mythology about disability. I think it's valuable in thinking back and taking a closer look at this, and comparing it not just to the reality of navigating ableism when you're disabled, but also looking at how the conversation about ableism just seems to get written off as one-off corner cases that only affect a tiny portion of the population at best, or whataboutisms at worst. For this, there are three main pieces of media I'd like to look at: The Simpsons, King of the Hill, and, God help me because I physically hurt from having to watch it, South Park.
You're abusing a program intended to help the unfortunate.
I'm not saying it isn't sleazy, honey.
A 2000 article published in the Berkeley Journal of Employment and Labor Law by Carrie Lachine and a second by Linda Hamilton Krieger both discuss and research the sentiments surrounding the ADA. The former analyzes both court cases brought forth because of the ADA and the way radio and televised media would comment on these cases. Some cases include Sutton v. U.S. Airlines, where the point of contention is if it's reasonable to not hire pilots that wear glasses for not meeting vision requirements. The court ultimately held at point of writing that the petitioners were not actually disabled because, to quote the article, they could not fully correct their visual impairments. It also points out several issues for disability advocates, like the fact that media focus on lawsuits gives the wrong impression that all the disability community does is sue, and ends up being one of the only ways non-disabled people conceptualize and engage with disability. There's also no control over which incidents become lawsuits, and they're not actively choosing parties or decisions. There's also not necessarily criticism of the courts, or the ways the law and those who enforce it perpetuate ableism themselves. In reality, the majority of cases with the ADA result in losses, usually on the grounds that the plaintiffs do not meet the standard to qualify for protection. One study found that plaintiffs lost more than 90% of cases. One of those major pieces, the one the article is even named after, is the Simpsons episode King Size Homer, where Homer intentionally gains a bunch of weight so he can qualify as being disabled under the ADA and be able to work remotely. The episode does make brief reference to such programs, but Homer is framed as sleazy and exploitative. Lisa points this out as him taking advantage of a program to help people in need. But even imagining the motivations behind the ADA as being this altruistic push for justice and supporting the people in need isn't quite accurate. Before the ADA was signed into law, the president also vetoed a bill raising minimum wage. It came 51 minutes after the bill reached the president's desk. 2 days after the ADA signing ceremony, then US President Bush also vetoed the Family and Medical Leave Act, which offers accommodations for workers of paid leave in the event of illness or childbirth. His defense is that such practices should not be mandated by the government. This is also within a few decades of the repeal of the last ugly laws of the 1970s, which allow for police removal of disabled people for showing some kind of disability visually. Much of this sentiment comes into play when looking at The Simpsons. The plot of King Size Homer is pretty bare bones. It opens with Homer wanting to work from home and is sneaking out of doing work-mandated exercises. There's mention that one of their co-workers is at home on disability. Lenny describes the accommodation as a lottery that rewards stupidity, since the guy was injured on the job, and apparently Lenny thinks he got what he deserves. I guess ableist Lenny is canon.
Not Lenny!
This segment really illustrates the very common sentiment about disability, that those who are disabled did something to deserve it. This episode imagines disability as a way to exit the rat race that is our capitalistic society. Diabetes, for example, is very frequently stigmatized as a disability for fat, lazy people who need to exercise more and take care of themselves, which other shows like King of the Hill will go on to mock in conjunction with intermingling fat phobia and ableism in the late 2000s. As mentioned, this Simpsons episode directly references one of the cases made famous centering around discourse about the ADA. Some of these cases included situations like a man who brought a loaded gun to work arguing he was protected by having a psychiatric disability, or a woman with obesity who sued a movie theater because she couldn't fit into the seats. Mind you, while these cases saw focus and attention in news media, the fact that they were dismissed at the administrative level or in court was never focused on to the same degree. I also want to acknowledge that obesity is itself a term that medicalizes fat bodies and carries a lot of harm and stigma in the way that medical fat phobia is poorly understood by most lay people. I'm only using the term in this context to give a sense for what courts at the time recognized, and what The Simpsons is reacting to and directly referencing. Back to the episode, Homer tries to intentionally get injured in order to get an accommodation to work from home and escape exercising, but to no avail.
Carpal tunnel syndrome? No. Lumbar lung? No. Juggler's despair? No. Achy breaky pelvis? No. Oh, I'm never gonna be disabled. I'm sick of being so healthy.
He then learns that he can qualify to work from home if he weighs 300 pounds and starts on a plan to gain weight on purpose to qualify on the grounds of being obese. Now, if you know The Simpsons, you know it's a regular occurrence that Homer's boss, Mr. Burns, is an extremely wealthy, greedy asshole. There are numerous episodes, like Brother Can You Spare 2 Dimes, where Homer is deceived into settling things out of court by Burns because of their poor health standards, and it results in Homer being sterilized without his knowledge, and they don't want to get sued for it. There's also the fact that Mr. Burns exploits Springfield with no regard for others' health, safety, or housing, destroying Springfield, leaving several of its citizens injured, disabled, or displaced from their homes, all for making money when he already has an obscene amount. Keep in mind, this episode exists in the very same season as King Size Homer. Long story short, The Simpsons is no stranger to continually pointing out how work and employers are not only exploitative, they're a source of disablement, as seen quite directly multiple times with Homer. In fact, numerous issues from repetitive strain injuries to things like black lung, asbestosis, and several other illnesses are a direct consequence of capitalism and the exploitation of people within it. And yet, despite this, the framing still censors the employer in how Homer is imagined and constructed as a cautionary idea of a manipulative trickster gaming the system and making things harder for the real disabled people, while Homer is a faker cashing in and trying to escape his fate within the working class. This is going to be a recurring thing, and it's a big part of why I really don't like leaving the conversation around media like this that, well, they're not meant to be a good person, so of course we're not meant to sympathize with their actions or agree with them. I understand where this comes from, but I really want to get away from this line of thinking and focus more on framing rather than depiction. Because it's not technically wrong. Homer isn't meant to be seen as in the right here. But while it's not incorrect, it's also not complete either. Even Lisa objects, pointing out that Homer is abusing a program intended to help the less fortunate, which by Homer's own admission is a sleazy thing for him to do. It's also imagined as a way for Homer to free himself from the tyranny of capitalism, this idea that disabled people are basically given a free ticket out of the difficulties of capitalism and are constantly coddled and cared for. I want you to think less about Homer individually and more about how this narrative is constructed directly in response to the ADA and is steeped in many of the ableist sentiments around it. This also ties into the idea of viewing those who have to care for disabled people as both heroes and victims who have to put up with such useless, burdensome people. Like, you see how quickly we get into harmful thinking. There's this running joke too with Dr. Nick being the one to support Homer's plan. He's a shady doctor, and no real or reliable authority would ever be able to trust what Homer's doing or participate in what he's doing. In short, it imagines the ADA as a way for sleazy fakers to make it harder for the real disabled people, as we have our voice of reason in Lisa point out, which sidesteps the real issue, which is that employers want no accountability in having to consider the existence of disabled people. That said, it's easier to rely on fat-phobic sentiments and imagine Homer as sleazy, lazy, and immoral in his actions. Lachine makes a connection with welfare policy experts bringing in the concept of the undeserving poor, pointing out how people are met with an inherent degree of scrutiny and suspicion with policies evaluating how legitimate and worthy one is, with focus around obesity, substance use disorders, psychiatric disabilities, learning disabilities, and myalgic encephalomyelitis, or ME. And with that, the episode uses Homer as a stand-in as the sort of people who are imagined to be the only ones making use of the ADA, this idea of the disabled faker who is simply lazy and sleazy, trying to free themselves from work. The articles and studies themselves make solid points, but I like to build off their foundation. For one, this data observes ADA cases through the status of the trial. It's not uncommon for a disabled person to be discriminated against by an employer or some other institution and not have the time or means to bring things to court. They also can just reasonably believe that they won't have their case taken seriously and don't bother trying. It also assumes that you have access to a means of formally establishing that you are indeed disabled to said institutions. Seeking accommodations is an extremely inaccessible process, because you have to get very specific mentions in your documentation. This means that if you have, say, headaches, but your stuff doesn't say that, it's not unheard of to have to go through the whole process from the start, and your symptoms could just change or be dynamic. Many disabled people don't have the money for that, especially if they're going up against their employer who is causing this in the first place. Once Homer finally qualifies for his disability claim, they hold a press event to commemorate it, where Homer is very openly stigmatized by everyone around him.
What's the name of this gastropod?
Thank you for your pity.
When I grow up, I want to be a lardo on workman's comp just like Dad.
Homer is treated with a large degree of disgust, like Smithers putting a towel on Homer's shoulder so Mr. Burns doesn't have to touch him directly for their photo. The paper article itself also says Burns survives Rush with shut-in. It'd be one thing if this stigma of the episode itself is openly challenging or highlighting, but there's an underlying agreement that Homer deserves to be talked about this way. There's a lot to be said about the fact that Homer half-asses his job on the regular, and most of the time he can be played as comedic or even sympathetic for it. It's relatable how he works a job he not only hates, but is actively hazardous to his health to support his family. And it's relatable for how he sticks it to the man and tries in some way to not have to do his shitty day job.
Lisa, if you don't like your job, you don't strike. You just go in every day and do it really half-assed. That's the American way.
We see repeatedly that they use fat phobia as a shorthand to express that Homer is lazy and manipulative, and how he uses a program that takes away from real disabled people. Although honestly, what does working remotely here actually change with his job? The Simpsons is undeniably one of the most influential pieces of television ever produced, but it's important to take that with how often it can drop the ball. Homer is repeatedly subjected to fat-phobic jeers, which comes to a more direct point where we see the direct reference to the ADA suit mentioned earlier. The scene, 16 minutes in, sees Homer being denied access to a movie theater because he's too large to be seated. This is the main way of tying this episode to the ADA, considering this is one of the big, almost mythological ideas that's stuck in the minds of many, and how absurd a case it may be seen as. But remember, the overwhelming majority of those cases resulted in losses. And this case didn't even make it that far in the first place. Also, seating access is hardly even a hot take to co-sign in the first place, because seating is a very basic issue and that is still a problem now. Homer is mocked even more by a crowd for his fat body, with the owner offering him a garbage bag full of popcorn to try and satisfy him. And Homer is understandably angry about this and gives a genuine call out about stereotyping fat people.
I'm sick of all your stereotypes and cheap jokes. The overweight individuals in this country are just as smart and talented and hardworking as everybody else, and they're gonna make their voices heard. All they need is a leader. I'll work harder than ever before and show the world overweight people aren't undisciplined, lazy, and irresponsible. What happened to my bird?
This sounds nice, except the framing of this scene isn't meant to be taken seriously, and instead a subversion, considering the very next scene proves Homer wrong. You see, he left the theater when he was supposed to be working and uses a drinking bird to type for him since he was given yes/no prompts at his computer. The bird hits Y for him, so he left, and doing so resulted in a gas buildup at the plant that will cause an explosion. In other words, Homer's laziness resulted in this, and it undermines any of the moment of Homer's speech about fat phobia, which ends up validating the stigma everyone had toward him as reasonable. This episode is basically constant fat jokes in and out, but it's also important to consider the intersection of ableism and fat phobia, and how the two are interlinked to present the ADA as a means for lazy, manipulative tricksters to exploit the system. Homer ends up rushing to the plant to manually release the gas on site. He doesn't make it on time to shut it off, but because he's so fat, he plugs the release himself when he falls, saving Springfield. He ends up losing the weight through liposuction Mr. Burns pays for because he's annoyed and tired of trying to get Homer to exercise. Throughout both this episode and in news media in the non-fictional setting, there's a continued sentiment of disabled people as unreliable narrators to our own bodies, autonomy, and lives. We're continually sold a myth that disabled people are just needy adult babies, not willing to do any work, and are burdensome, exploitative, demanding leeches, as depicted in the comic referenced in one of the main two journal pieces I have here. One study found that 3.8% of cases from 1992 to 98 resulted in reasonable cause determinations of any kind. Despite this, the overwhelming narrative and sentiment repeatedly spun is that the law is being abused and forced out-of-control fakers running about. The most common defense is that the gatekeeping works, and we're right to continue doing it. But we'll save that more for the conclusion section as we bring this together. For now, the question I want to leave you with is simple. Who does this line of thinking benefit most? We can get a clearer picture in looking at the next episode in King of the Hill's Junkie business.
Ew. People like you, who abuse the system, ruin it for the rest of us, the truly disabled.
Junkie Business gives a much more direct insight than The Simpsons because the episode explicitly names the ADA and centers entirely around it. A few things to qualify though. 1. Junkie is extremely stigmatizing language, and it was back when this episode aired to refer to someone with a substance use disorder. So going forward, I will not be using it. 2. I'm not getting on this episode's case because I demand that an animated TV series give an accurate depiction of the ADA. What I'm interrogating is the idea of how the episode, much like The Simpsons, frames the conversation. How it imagines the ADA as opening the gates to soul-sucking leeches taking advantage of businesses and being able to twist the arms of poor business owners like Buck Strickland, and how it goes against the American principle of an honest day's hard work. The episode starts with Hank at his job. He's assistant manager at Strickland Propane, and he's been tasked with hiring a new sales employee. So, Hank knowingly asks several questions he's clearly been told are illegal by phrasing them in such a way that tries to bypass those requirements on a technicality. It's very clear that Hank does a horrible job at onboarding. For instance, he passes on one candidate solely because they didn't like a restaurant that Hank likes. It comes to a climax with the only qualified candidate he gets named Maria. During the interview, he keeps calling for Mario, assuming it must be a typo because it couldn't possibly be a woman applying for the job. Even after she clarifies it's hers, he still keeps asking. Now, Maria very clearly knows her stuff. During the interview, she demonstrates she's already extremely knowledgeable about the different grills they carry. It's made clear she is the most qualified candidate they have. But during their interview, Hank asks inappropriate questions and ultimately decides to pass on Maria because she doesn't know a question about Troy Aikman.
Well, your qualifications are impressive, but I do have one last puzzler. Ms. Montalvo, you're at the Troy Aikman Fantasy Sports Camp. It's the toughest 14 days you'll ever love, and on the bus ride home...
Excuse me. Who's Troy Aikman?
On the one hand, she booted the Aikman question. On the other, she knew about the Char King. Well, she's more qualified than any other applicant, but that only goes so far. I mean, what are we going to talk about? Our feelings?
Hank commits a very blatant form of hiring discrimination and fails to do any kind of due diligence, background check, or proper interviewing in bringing on a new candidate. He decides to hire the last person, Leon, who shows up later based solely on Leon identifying Hank's Dallas Cowboys calendar and a single question about what he thinks about propane. Now with this, you would think that Hank would be presented as in the wrong or something. Hank is not at all a perfect man, and some of the best episodes of the series come from Hank realizing the error of his ways and just being wrong. He's not always the voice of reason. But that's not really what the episode does. At least it doesn't recognize Hank as being misogynistic here, nor does it negate the ableism that lingers throughout the rest of the episode. Hank, for instance, tells his wife Peggy about passing up Maria, and Peggy gets upset at him, but more because she thinks Hank found her too attractive to work with and not for the hiring discrimination. Now, keep in mind, it was Peggy who told him he couldn't ask questions about religion, gender, and sexuality in the first place. She even says how she relates to being discriminated against as a woman in the workforce herself, and this never really gets brought up beyond Peggy being this little running gag. Things don't go well with Leon as he's several hours late and uses drugs while at work, which the ADA literally does not protect you from. Hank has to bring in his son Bobby to pick up the slack at work, and Bobby is the one to bring the problem up at the dinner table.
I have to do all the work because Dad's new employee is a drug addict.
Now, Hank points out that Leon has strong credentials. He mistakenly thought that Leon worked in a non-profit when they're actually rehab centers. Leon isn't even lying about this or deceiving Hank, who failed to do any kind of proper vetting. Also, I know this isn't analysis related or anything, but I gotta say, this episode is also just boring as shit. Ableism aside, it's just not a very funny or even interesting episode to watch. Anyway, Hank fires him but allows Leon to take the day off early and gives him a card to seek help and intervention for substance use. Buck Strickland gets worried because he says that Leon looks disgruntled and warns Hank a few times to not let him shoot the place up with a .45 and let him down gently. Leon comes back with a legal official who points out that Leon has the right to work because of the ADA.
It's against the law to fire this man. He's a drug addict.
Are you sure you don't want to shoot me?
Anthony specifically invokes the ADA, saying that it ensures that no person, no matter how disadvantaged, how short or obese or gay or even stoned, can be discriminated against once his healing has begun. Again, not how the ADA works. Hank tries to set boundaries like start times, but Anthony says that Leon has withdrawal therapy until 11 and thus has to come in later in the workday. He also needs to have the lights dimmed. He also gets a futon in the workstation because he's disabled. Any company with 15 or more employees must make reasonable accommodations for their workers. Then Leon asks to be called Hank Hill, and Anthony tells him it's the law and he has to call him Hank. Like, what is this? So because of this, all the other workers, including Joe Jack, start to make up disabilities themselves to get out of doing work, and it starts a spiral of not doing any work.
Now all my employees want in on that damn Americans with Disabilities Act.
Hank, you cannot stand by while these greedy pigs suck the life out of Strickland propane. Anybody's disabled if you think hard enough.
So, like before, we have a case where the ADA is imagined as a way to open the floodgates of fakers exploiting the system, and it never helping any real disabled people. There's also a unique contrivance, much like we saw with Mr. Burns in The Simpsons. If you've watched King of the Hill, you'll know that Buck Strickland is really a piece of shit. In one episode, he frames Hank for murder, and Hank is really the only reason this branch of Strickland has any success. Buck also regularly steals from company funds, which we see he spends on sex workers at strip clubs, and regularly exploits his position for the women he has affairs with. He's misogynistic, he's exploitative, and many of his own business decisions are self-centered and unethical. It's not a moral failing, but despite how he stigmatizes Leon, he openly deals with many of the same challenges of having a substance use disorder. But the show is just willing to ignore all of that the moment disability comes into conversation, and suddenly he and his business are the victims of these fakers because of the ADA.
Ew. People like you who abuse the system ruin it for the rest of us, the truly disabled.
Strickland gets the idea to have Hank buy a bunch of drugs and spread them like roach traps in his words, and get Leon addicted so they can fire him legally. Instead, Hank makes up a disability, good worker syndrome, and quits because this job prevents him from doing any kind of work. Because of this, they no longer have 15 employees and they can do whatever they want and fire Leon and rehire Hank. It used to be a common condition among Americans until the dreaded ADA took over. So what we see again is this idea that sells this idea of disability as being used to exploit the system and not do any work, and how it uses substance use stigma as a way to frame Hank as more reasonable. One same study notes that from 1992 to 98, only 2.3% of the charges, not one cases, but just charges, were related to substance use disorders. It's important to think about how the specific choice in what disabilities are mocked relate to the proportion of cases filed as ADA lawsuits at the time. What most likely happened is the writers half heard one portion about the 15 employees segment and ran with it. It's valuable to recognize that this was a very common argument that the ADA is harmful to small businesses that don't have these things come up often. You can even listen to a speech from the then US president about this at the time.
And the bottom line was, I felt that a lot of people with disabilities could be wonderfully productive citizens if some of the laws were changed.
I also heard from Dick Thornburg very strongly that Lee Atwater was a big supporter of the ADA.
I think Lee was. Lee was thought of as a tough, gut-fighting, bare-knuckles politician, but this demonstrated a breadth and a kindness and a compassionate side that I'm glad Thornburg called to your attention. There were some people that worried about the costs, the expenses that would be put to bear on a lot of small businesses, for example.
The framing behind most of his speech centers around seeing the ADA as getting more people to work, and not questioning the system of employment itself, especially in tying essentials to live, like access to food, healthcare, and medicine to employment. It's less about human rights or centering accessibility, and more championing disabled people as inspirations in their productivity. Remember, this also took place around the time frame where we're still seeing the consequences of the war on drugs. Bush also vetoed a minimum wage increase just under an hour after it reached his desk within a year before signing the ADA. Our first lie is that the ADA makes the laziest people invincible from being held accountable by their employees, and that anyone can just claim anything and get away with it. So Hank does get a form of comeuppance in the sense that after quitting he's rehired on probation, but the episode never does anything beyond using this sentiment to promote an ableist myth that the ADA exists to be exploited by fakers taking advantage of employers. Hank's blatant misogyny is little more than a running joke and never framed as an actual problem to be challenged. The extent of him committing hiring discrimination and him properly failing to vet his candidate, and this whole thing being his fault in the first place, is only bad in the sense that Hank allowed everyone to become a bunch of lazy slackers at work, and not Hank is perpetuating a very pervasive form of ableism and misogyny. We're left with this idea, based on how easily the other employees all claim to be disabled to justify not doing work, is that accommodations for disabilities at work are just special treatment. King of the Hill has some very hit or miss representation when it comes to disability-related issues. Unfortunately, more misses than hits with episodes like Cotton's Plot, where Peggy is disabled from an injury and the episode frames her ignoring her physical therapy in favor of Cotton pushing her into overcoming her disability, because he's disabled too, is a good thing. Or Diabetic Shock, where Bill is the victim of medical discrimination from his physician, and lateral ableism the show never recognizes, but the episode acts as if he's in the wrong and only sympathetic for beating and overcoming diabetes.
Con?
Sadness covers me like a blanket. Tuck me in, let me die.
There are also several episodes that do a better job, like say Hank's backstory, where Hank deals with ableism from his friends and family when diagnosed with diminished gluteal syndrome, and has to wear essentially a fake bud, which the episode rightfully points out is a medical device. But many of the same episodes do better work incidentally. The one I feel best highlights this is Hank's back, the unbearable lightness of being Hank. An episode where Hank injures his back and has to take temporary leave from his job. Hank is met with ableism by a workman's comp agent who keeps trying to test if he's really disabled. King of the Hill is very critical of physicians like we see in episodes like this and Diabetic Shock. But it's less that physicians are harmful because of the ableism they perpetuated in these episodes, and more that these physicians are a bunch of overeducated eggheads who are also needlessly bureaucratic, considering how often King of the Hill presents such people in these positions as antagonistic villains of the week.
Then I'm sorry, but all Western medicine can really offer you are drugs and nothing.
Like, sure, I know a lot of disabled people who would find this line relatable, but it's not really meant to point out a problem of systemic ableism in the world of medicine, even if out of context this line is super relatable.
Boy, a lot of paperwork, huh?
It's half my job. The other half is exposing fakers.
Why would anybody fake it? I love the look on a customer's face when I top off their propane tank. The government can't send me that kind of satisfaction in the mail.
Mr. Hill, you can take it down a notch.
There's nothing here, but you say that you can't straighten up. Maybe the first thing we should look at...
What did you do that for?
It slipped. As I was saying, back injuries vary. I've found the best course of treatment.
What the god-dang?
Oh, well played, Mr. Hill.
This is a great scene with no other context to highlight medical ableism, but the episode only sympathizes with Hank insofar as he's actively trying to get back to work, unlike the kind of fakers we see. This episode's framing and thesis is less medical ableism is a major problem, and more workman's comp agents are needlessly bureaucratic and don't actually help anyone with feeling better to get them back to work. Also, as a not-so-fun fact, Mike Judge, creator of King of the Hill, has also gone on to say that Junkie Business is one of his favorite episodes in a 2006 interview. So that informs quite a bit. Still not proof enough? Let's look at Idiocracy, a film co-produced and directed by Mike Judge, which also happened to come out in 2006. I made the unfortunate choice to watch it both for this and for a future video, where I'll discuss it alongside WALL-E and other film and TV from the early 2000s, which contributed to this idea of disability as dystopia, as I'll dub it for now. So, Idiocracy it's literal eugenics, from start to finish. It starts by pointing out that the fall of humanity and decline in intelligence is a direct result of poor, or in the movie's words, stupid people having too many children and outbreeding smarter, wealthier couples. So while it's very clear that there's an aesthetic criticism of capitalism and how this lesser intelligence results in a great deal of pollution and companies taking advantage of people, it still does that by using disability, poverty, and fatness as a form of moral degeneracy that caused this. There's an obvious aspect of government corruption and exploitation, as the reason the protagonist gets stuck in the future is because a government official gets involved with a pimp and wants to talk about all the wild shit he did. Oh yeah, this movie is also very anti-black and racist, by the way. But it is not an anti-capitalist work. It's not even that uncommon because we see a similar visual argument in the film WALL-E, which has almost shot for shot the same ending as Idiocracy, and the same framing in how a dystopian future utilizes fatness and disability as markers of moral degeneracy, and even has the same shot of relearning how to grow a plant to save the hopeless future. Like WALL-E, there is this dystopian pileup of garbage that comes about and plays on a lot of the environmentalism trend that was present in a lot of early 2000s media. Think the Simpsons movie, Happy Feet, and of course the most important work of our time, the Sly Cooper trilogy, with several environmentalist themes throughout its second and third games. The way poverty and improper language is stigmatized in Idiocracy also makes the commentary much more direct. We're told that the English language had, quote, deteriorated into a hybrid of hillbilly, valley girl, inner city slang, and various grunts, and I'm going to guess the white people who wrote in the pimp and the army guy saying my niggas earlier probably sees language as not nuanced.
Okay, my niggas, we're almost set here.
When you have such lines as the constant use of the R and F slurs and white people using the N-word, works like this from the early 2000s that had this major push of environmentalism imagine disability, fatness, and poverty as a form of dystopia in and of itself. It never actually humanizes the victims of capitalism, and instead asserts that the fall of humanity is merely stupid people, that laziness, fatness, and how we as humans allow such things to take place. Even in WALL-E's ending, it may be upbeat and happy, the fat characters don't change, but they are only framed as sympathetic for them putting in hard labor and work. Many fat people may recognize this because it's the equivalent of seeing a fat person at the gym and going, well, you shouldn't make fun of them because they're here to change. Like, no, you shouldn't mock or dehumanize people, period. WALL-E and other works like it grant fat bodies probationary humanity, provided they're actively recognizing their own degeneracy and working on deviating from it or becoming thinner and less lazy. Idiocracy's essential argument is that smart people are just outbred and corporate greed festers in how it preys on inherently less intelligent people, and works from authors like Mike Judge actively contributed to this during this time period. For The Simpsons, we were first sold on this myth that disability protections are exploited by lazy fakers who take advantage of the system and make it worse for people who really need it. King of the Hill brings up the very sentiments expressed in drafting the ADA, and that it was treated as if small businesses would fall victim to exploitation to justify denial of accessibility. What will happen years later when we jump to South Park's depiction of Tourette syndrome?
Carmen's Tourette's isn't real. He's faking.
Faking?
First things first, I'd like to give a content warning for the depiction of tics in case you're suggestible to seeing or hearing other tics. I do my best to keep footage and clips to vocal tics without the audio playing. I realize that for the context of this video that most of these cases are going to be about characters pretending they have some kind of tic disorder, mostly and specifically Tourette syndrome, but I'd rather be safe than sorry. If you're someone who doesn't have or isn't familiar with tic disorders, it's generally good practice to give content warnings for tics because they can be suggestible for other people with tic disorders. Think like how if you see someone yawning, it can make you want to yawn. It's kinda like that, only because someone might be in the middle of doing something, or they may have other disabilities like chronic pain that having your tics set off can be quite debilitating. Before jumping in and analyzing this South Park episode, I first want to go over a bit about some very basic stuff over TS. There's already multiple videos about Le Petite Tourette, the episode we'll be discussing, but I feel many of them don't adequately address the framing behind the episode and instead leave the conversation at the accuracy of the depiction of several of the traits. For those not aware, Tourette syndrome is a disorder most known for having motor and vocal tics or involuntary movements or noises. Sometimes it's compared to sneezing. Stress is also known to exacerbate tics. TS falls under the neurodivergent umbrella alongside tic disorders. Of note, there are a few definitions I'd like to go over for the purposes of this video. A tic is a sudden involuntary motor movement for motor tics or sound for vocal or phonic tics. Characteristically, tics are reduced during sleep and may be simple or complex. Coprolalia is the involuntary uttering of obscenities or blasphemous words or phrases. Copropraxia is the involuntary and inappropriate use of obscene gestures, such as the middle finger. This is by no means a complete list, but the reason I list these tics in particular is to discuss the time and context during which they saw a rise in media portrayals. There was a 2012 study done on the portrayal of Tourette syndrome in film and television published in neurology journals. It conducted a review of about 37 pieces of media from 1976 to 2010, looking not just at how many portrayals of TS there were, but what traits were portrayed, measuring both how particular vocal and motor tics were shown. Film and TV like South Park, 500 Days of Summer, The Simpsons, Boondock Saints, Not Another Teen Movie, Touched by an Angel, Ally McBeal, Dexter, Malcolm in the Middle, Shameless, and Nurse Jackie, to name a few, all have portrayals of TS of some kind. You'll also notice in particular that coprolalia takes up a large portion of the pie chart for vocal tics. There are two major findings in this study I'd like to focus on. First is the fact that the study found the largest number of film and TV characters with Tourette's took place after the year 1990. One reasonable angle we can speculate from is to consider the portrayal of Tourette syndrome as a side effect of the reaction to the ADA, which as we established passed in 1990. As mentioned in the portion about The Simpsons, one of the most commonly mocked family of disabilities is pretty much anything under the neurodivergent umbrella, especially tic disorders like Tourette's. The same study notes that comedies and drama make the majority of Tourette portrayals. It stands to reason that we can also look at portrayals of TS as an extension of mockery toward the concept of accessibility through the ADA in 90s and 2000s media.
Give me a W! Give me a Y! Give me a lick my pussy ass cock shit!
The second finding was that neck bending was the most common motor tic shown, and coprolalia for vocal tics. In fact, portrayals of characters pretending to have TS, 75% or 11 out of 15 of them, specifically did this through imitating coprolalia. Now of course there are limitations, like being English-speaking media only, and the fact that these are likely US-centered. My goal here isn't so much to capture every single instance of TS in the media, but instead to highlight how, in the US specifically, the manner in which people approach what they think about disabled people shifts in response to a major event like a law passing that put disability more on their minds. It stands to reason how we see fat phobia and substance use disorder stigma used that the idea of the undeserving poor comes into focus with how specific types of disabilities get mocked here. Given the evidence brought forth from this study, I think it's valuable to contextualize portrayals of Tourette syndrome in US media, especially as a way of showcasing ableist sentiments acting in part in reaction to the ADA. Ableism obviously did not start with the ADA, and these kind of beliefs existed well before then. But South Park I think is by far the most valuable way to think about the third stage of the disabled faker mythology. I also want to make it clear up front that I have no problem with the depiction of coprolalia in media. It's real, and it should not be stigmatized either. Having said that, we have to consider how often, as we've seen, that portrayals of it are specifically characters faking that they have Tourette's. Written by non-disabled authors, portrayed by non-disabled actors for a non-disabled audience. It's not written in a way designed to humanize people with TS, let alone those with specific vocal or motor tics. It's honestly a shame that a show like, say, BoJack Horseman never really got a character with Tourette syndrome, and how much the show loves tongue twisters, wordplay, puns, and whatnot. There is so much comedic gold if we just moved beyond person pretends to have Tourette so they can swear a lot. But enough stalling.
Let's just get this over with.
The episode begins with Hartmann hearing a kid swearing in a store and assumes that he just has a cool mom. He discovers that this kid, as his mother explains to the others in the area, has Tourette syndrome, and describes her son's tics as similar to sneezing. It's not something he can control, and it just happens even if he tries to hold it in, so to speak. Upon learning what TS is, Hartmann, who if you've never watched South Park, is basically one of those adult sitcom characters where their whole thing is intentionally being as awful a person as possible. He gets excited at learning what TS is and begins singing "I Have a Golden Ticket" from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory because he sees an opportunity to fake having Tourette syndrome as an excuse to swear around people. Where I find this kind of frustrating is that conversations with adult animation in particular, and media where we have characters who are deliberately written to be awful people, is that the conversation basically stops at "they're supposed to be a bad person," which more or less means that they're satirizing or making fun of their bigotry. What it misses is the underlying framing around how such characters are used to make a specific commentary and setting them up as these awful caricatures. I've talked about this quite extensively in my video analyzing the Boondocks because it runs into similar issues. For one, there's already an underlying assumption both in this scene and throughout the episode that the real disabled people can declare themselves as such in everyday settings and not be questioned in any way, and have their autonomy and voice taken seriously. Like we've seen in all these media, there's this assumption that people are perfectly accepting of disabled people, provided they're real, and that the world just bends over backwards for you if you're disabled. The framing of these episodes is always, well, he's supposed to be bad and you're not meant to sympathize with him. But that doesn't mean that we're demonstrating a what not to do. In this episode's setup of showcasing Hartmann as the disabled faker pretending to have Tourette syndrome, it constructs a continued myth that people like Hartmann are rampant and thus must be scrutinized. Hartmann sees a neurologist who evaluates him and points out that most of the time these traits are exhibited at a younger age. But Hartmann manages to just easily deceive everyone. Like we see with Dr. Nick endorsing Homer's weight plan in The Simpsons, there's also this recurring element that medical professionals too easily endorse just anyone with any kind of disability, and the implicit argument underneath is that they require more scrutiny. I discussed this already in my Good Times video, but a similar thing happened in the 90s with ADHD and the media focus around both it and Adderall. As mentioned, a lot of it perpetuates the same ideas that diagnostic criteria is way too lax, that it's just an excuse for disruptive, loud boys to act however they want, and in South Park's case has one joke where the doctor suggests just beating your kids instead as a form of treatment. There's also the same conflation of substance use disorder stigma in imagining taking medication either as if you're doing drugs, imagining it as doing performance-enhancing drugs, or cheating your way through work and at school.
My God, is she brave, standing up to that freaked-out junkie.
Dad, that junkie is your son.
Why don't you just tell everybody?
The Simpsons did it when Bart was diagnosed with ADHD. King of the Hill did it where Bobby is misdiagnosed because he ate multiple bowls of sugary cereal, and the school nurse misdiagnosed him based on being energetic and disruptive in class. South Park has everyone being diagnosed with it, and having a bunch of zombie children with the takeaway that it's an excuse not to beat your kids, to discipline them instead.
We all have attention deficit disorder, so we all started taking Ritalin. It really takes the edge off, man. You should try it.
So that's why all you children are acting so damn bored.
That's correct, Chef.
Damn it, children, you don't need drugs to make you pay attention in school. In my day, if we didn't pay attention, we got a belt to the bottom. Now they try to cure everything with drugs.
Praising this episode for having researched traits of Tourette syndrome while overlooking the framing and how it's used misses the point. It's especially troubling when you consider that South Park already did this with ADHD. Kyle, our voice of reason, is the first to bluntly just say that he's faking and is met with hostility for it. There's irony in the framing of the episode that Kyle is treated with hostility by everyone around him, including characters who actually have TS, in calling Cartman out on his faking. But everyone around him is simply too trusting.
Look, I was just suggesting that maybe this one person could control what he said, but just didn't. For fun.
Kyle is punished for calling out Cartman and is forced to attend a support group who all discuss how it's not fun to have Tourette syndrome and they find it embarrassing. In particular, there's one kid where his parents got divorced because his dad got tired of all the stigma his son faced, so we evoke this idea of pity. But there's another thing going on in how the episode frames the two portrayals of TS, both from Cartman faking it versus the real people who actually have it. We're sold on this idea that there exist these fakers at every given point trying to manipulate others for social benefits, attention, and resources. But with that comes a second myth, that the real disabled people have their needs met, that they're recognized as disabled in the first place, and that they are burdensome and pitiable by their very existence, and most importantly, for our purposes, are happy to receive allyship from cracking down on the fakers. You see, one of the kids with Tourette syndrome later finds out that Cartman is faking, and decides to help Kyle expose and stop Cartman. Kyle is accused of making fun of disabled people, but the whole point of this is that we know he's ultimately right. The real problem is just that people are way too lax and too trusting of people like Hartmann. It doesn't matter how accurate the individual depiction of TS traits are, when we're sold this myth that in the real world is designed to benefit employers, universities, and other institutions that don't want to spend time and resources envisioning and investing in a more accessible world. There's a lot to be said about the fact that this episode makes this thinly veiled excuse to shoehorn in a lot of anti-Semitism for laughs, and how Cartman says the K slur in particular. It's being used to make an ableist trope function and that Cartman is faking, but that doesn't suddenly make this some super progressive, insightful commentary about anything. It tries to imagine cracking down on the fakers as a form of allyship toward the real disabled people who are assumed to have their needs met and are assumed to be able to be formally recognized as disabled in the first place. Cartman takes to television where they just immediately believe him and he wants to be anti-Semitic on TV. However, he learns that he starts blurting out embarrassing things about himself involuntarily, because he's been pretending for so long now and is genuinely afraid he'll embarrass himself on TV. He begins talking about the situation as if it's an actual disability, and it's framed like he's getting a taste of his own medicine. The book Disability in the Media, Examining Stigma and Identity also cites several studies analyzing media in both the 90s and early 2000s and supports the same claims made throughout this video. It also looks at criminality of disability-related media. One study finding that in the early 1990s, 44% of characters with cognitive disabilities were portrayed as murderers, rapists, robbers, or committing violent crimes. So Kyle and the kid both team up to set up a Chris Hansen-style sting, from To Catch a Predator, where they lured a bunch of predators to the TV set and they all die by suicide when they see Chris Hansen. Hartmann ultimately gets off with no real consequences, with Kyle ending the show saying "ah shit" since he ultimately lost. Now, I want to think about the fact that our TS study found an increase in portrayals of characters in US media imitating Tourette's starting in the 1990s. In other words, after the passing of the ADA, and especially in comedies like South Park. When this episode gets discussed, it's fairly common to also bring up the fact that the TSA, the Tourette Syndrome Association, later renamed TAA, or Tourette Association of America, wrote about this episode. Their statement points out that the episode still perpetuates the myth that most people with Tourette's have coprolalia, but has an episode that credits how well researched the episode was and how it gives accurate information about TS. Setting aside how, as we pointed out, this fails to look at the broader framing and how the faker trope is used, as well as the near-constant anti-Semitism that anyone and everyone should be bringing up, the other issue is using the TAA as a source on its own. You see, what happens a lot in the media industry is that disabled people make up a very small percentage of the overall industry, because of how inaccessible the space is for people. And it leads to this very circular reasoning of, well, we can't ask them or have them in our production spaces because there just aren't any. So what you see happen too often in film and TV is that leaders will have consultants from organizations like the TAA or sensitivity writers that don't necessarily have guidance to them. A great example of this is a show I've talked about in the past, The Proud Family, in its episode about autism. However, the problem is that it has Holly Robinson Peete as a consultant, a woman who to my knowledge is not autistic, her son is. Nothing about us without us is how the saying about disability representation in film and TV goes. It's hardly any kind of good disability representation when the only disabled character is also an infant with no spoken dialogue to share their thoughts, while the main character is instead a therapist. It's important not to conflate organizations like this with the communities of the disability their org was founded for. Many of them do not meaningfully include disabled people in the process, and it can become far more frustrating when they're particularly exclusive of Black and other non-white disabled people. For example, that very same organization still platforms Brittany Wolf, who does a lot of coverage for Tourette's discussions. This is after Brittany uploaded a video that is still up at time of writing, in which she interviews Officer Craig, aka Tourette Cop. Interviewing a cop and positioning such a person as a welcome individual in a disability community at all is unacceptable, but it's made 10 times worse when you consider when this was posted. Wolf's Tourette Cop video went up on May 26, 2020, one day after the murder of George Floyd. Mind you, Officer Craig is literally a cop stationed in Minnesota. Several Black people with Tourette syndrome, in addition to other non-white disabled people, brought up how inappropriate this is, but Brittany outright refused to take this video down and insisted that the people bringing it up were trying to twist this into something it's not. There is no way to make a cop inclusive, progressive, or acceptable in any capacity. You are not for the disability community if you are willing to cozy up to cops, especially the day after the murder of a Black man reaches that level of media coverage. TAA continued to post Wolf's work and supports this platform even after this moment, and has had several other situations like this that are not inclusive of Black people with Tourette syndrome. Even then, stop platforming people like Brittany Wolf who align themselves with our oppressors. Discussing this South Park episode and praising it for its accurate information, or for having done the bare minimum of researching what Tourette's is, while ignoring the framing behind how it continues in the footsteps of The Simpsons, of King of the Hill, and perpetuating this faker myth that all three of these series also did with ADHD, is not okay. When you start to break down the framing of the South Park episode, focusing on the fact that it got the individual traits of the real disabled characters doesn't matter when that accuracy is used in service of manufacturing consent around defending institutions gatekeeping resources for disabled people. I bring all this up to talk about how these sentiments shape discussion about disability. Time and time again on social media, people bring up disability issues and consistently leap to eugenics and some of the most horrid takes imaginable. At the heart of it, I think, is the way that media largely manufactures consent around how people see disability issues. The first myth, of course, is that at any given point, there exists a rampant problem of people faking being disabled. The second myth is this continued idea that the real disabled people out there are overwhelmingly harmed by these fakers, and not the people and institutions that fail to accommodate them. There's also a third myth, that disabled people are already adequately sourced by these institutions, that disabled people have their material needs met, and that they're basically whisked away from the hardships of capitalism and how they're taken care of. If only those scummy fakers didn't ruin it for those who really need it.
Son of a bitch can walk? You didn't know? I never saw him take one step. He made me do everything.
On that first note, I'm not trying to argue that nobody has ever faked a disability. It does happen. What's often left out of conversations about people faking disabilities is how fakers fake disabilities and the why behind it. I can point to this guy, for example, who makes a platform out of public stunts, like him faking being disabled in this one. But this guy isn't performing disability to make a convincing act of someone with some form of tremors. He's doing so in the hopes of manufacturing a scenario, or more realistically, staging a public scenario in which he has an actor respond to an act of pity to signify their virtuousness. Even if somebody manages to fake being disabled for workplace accommodations or from Social Security, first of all, good luck trying to pull that off. It ignores the number of barriers that make it extremely difficult to actually pull off. Much like what we saw, the reality of accessibility and accommodations for people is the exact opposite, where it's rarely provided, yet we sell this myth that there's an out-of-control faker population. Many people focus on the aspect of fakers, but what happens in these narratives translates directly into how we talk about accommodations, accessibility, and ableism in real life outside of these fictionalized scenarios. As such, these aren't just comedic bits of fat phobia and ableism, but a form of revisionist history acting in response to perceived civil rights progress in favor of disabled people. Social Security disability is one of the most relevant examples that comes to mind. Despite the fear of the faker abusing the system, the real problem is the sheer volume of people who die even just trying to get on disability in the first place. Again, it assumes you have access to a healthcare provider, that you have reliable transportation to physically get to them, that your doctor is in no way harboring harmful sentiments around racial minorities, trans or intersex people, fat people, women, or other marginalized genders, and so on. From 2008 to 2019, nearly 110,000 people died after appealing after being denied SSD benefits. To put that in perspective, the football stadium at University of Michigan, one of the largest in the US, houses 100,000 people. They're dead. Also, if you're on disability yourself, or if you're informed enough about the issues, it also means that you're forced into perpetual poverty because of the savings cap you're held to. This means that if an emergency ever comes up, then by design, you're going to be devastated by it financially. Minimum wage laws also don't take into consideration benefits, which then cuts off even more income options for disabled people if they were to look into some form of part-time employment. This also functionally bars many disabled people from marriage. It also complicates having to do your taxes. Many of those programs to support disabled people are also extremely invasive to both you and anyone you live with. It's not unheard of for them to not only have income requirements, but require bank statements out of you or anyone you live with to qualify. I've seen a number of these kinds of programs in my time, but they get suggested to disabled people quite often by people who don't read the fine print and then act surprised when they fail them. You can be in the care of a family member, a partner, or someone, but then you're in a position where someone holds substantial financial, emotional, and physical power over you. These issues never get talked about as legitimate problems outside of disability spaces, even by self-proclaimed leftists because of said manufactured consent. That's what leads to the power of the next myth. As we saw throughout the media we reviewed, especially in South Park's narrative, we're sold on this idea that assumes baseline that real disabled people are always properly evaluated by a physician, that the physician is perfectly accessible and equitable, and that society meets the needs of disabled people. As a result, many are led to believe that by cracking down on the fakers and defending institutions making numerous obstacles, that they are serving the needs of disabled people by getting rid of those abusing the system.
Riley, how's my favorite little specially able nigga?
Oh man, it's great being I can't believe I never thought of this. I thought people had low expectations of me before. Homework? I can't do homework. Riley, why weren't you in class? Because I got lost. There might be a real future in this for me.
Of course, this is a lie. The ones who benefit from this are employers, universities, people who don't want to be held responsible or reconsider things, people who don't want to devote resources toward accessibility. Let's look at a real example with Alan Levinovitz, a religion professor. In September of 2024, he wrote a piece for the Chronicle titled, "Do Colleges Provide Too Many Disability Accommodations?" The title was later changed to what it currently is at time of writing. Are colleges getting disability accommodations all wrong? Probably to mask how blatantly ableist it was.
Who is he? He's an asshole, sir.
The article primarily centers around ADHD diagnoses and relies on the assumption that, you guessed it, a lot of them are just faking it, taking resources from people who really need it, and making unnecessary burden on faculty.
Say the line, Bart! I didn't do it.
There it is. There it is. Additionally, this article never once acknowledges that there's still an ongoing mass disabling event in the COVID-19 pandemic. Oh, excuse me, it does. It acknowledges that we are currently post-COVID and that things are not looking like what they used to. And that is not true. COVID is still very much around, but the US and many other countries have manufactured consent around declaring it over because it's financially beneficial not to be held responsible for it. What the Biden administration did do was encourage diverting funds intended for COVID relief for policing, though. The plan is just to kill disabled people with police, financial neglect, and criminalizing basic public health measures like masking. This is essentially another ADHD diagnoses are out of control piece. Thousands of people are dead or disabled from COVID. Higher ed is notoriously inaccessible. Johns Hopkins students made media focus specifically because of the ableism that led to them being forced out of the institutions around 2022, and we're still doing this. Sentiments like this are also where hostility toward self-diagnosis comes from.
All around the country, you bastard doctors are giving children Ritalin, and for every one child that actually needs it, you give it to 50,000 that don't.
Now, self-diagnosis is not without flaws. Mis- and disinformation is a thing. I don't deny that. But discussions around self-diagnosis of disabilities like ADHD without acknowledging structural neglect as well as medicalization and pathologization by the state is incomplete. Instead, there's just an assumption that because there are many ADHD diagnoses, that they must be fake and testing time doesn't make a difference anyway, instead leading to unnecessary burden. He assumes that because a handful of disability laws exist, including the ADA which he names, things must be equitable. That's in spite of the fact that, as we proved earlier, the overwhelming majority of cases resulted in losses, and the ADA itself never challenged how we conceptualize disability and exploitative labor from employers. In the years from the conclusion of this study to the present day, where at this very moment the state is actively weaponizing multiple pandemics as a eugenics tool, what changes do you think have improved the circumstances around disability justice? We are criminalizing taking protective action in an ongoing pandemic that this very same article explicitly frames as post-COVID, as over when it's not. It's also not unheard of for school counselors or care providers in general to misdiagnose undiscovered neurodivergence as anxiety. Ask me how I know. Even if it was anxiety or depression, schools still need to take that seriously and recognize a broader problem. For example, MIT had to take action to respond to suicides on campus, one of which directly centered around a student's chronic pain and another by their family's death. The bigger issue here is that there is no way to be a disability ally and preserve the concept of merit, because it's ultimately done in service of an exploitative society. Doing this acts as little more than serving the interests of the institution. Arguments like this Chronicle article also assume that healthcare workers are neutral people to interact with and don't engage with pathologization by the state. For example, drapetomania arose as a falsified disability in order to manufacture consent around the institution of slavery and anti-black exploited labor. If enslaved people ran away from being enslaved, they were mentally disabled because of their unnatural desire for freedom. Also, being too kind to slaves can trigger this mental disability. The concept of protest psychosis arose by pathologizing Black Panther protesters or those perceived as such using schizophrenia. An advertisement for Haldol, a medication used to treat schizophrenia, with the tagline about being assaultive and belligerent. Medical intervention does not exist in a neutral setting here. Far more recently, we've seen increased scrutiny toward excited delirium, which is used as a justification for police and medics to administer sedatives to people outside hospitals without consent. It's done under the pretense of safety due to their superhuman strength and high pain tolerance, aka an excuse to target Black, particularly Black disabled people. Police disproportionately harm and kill Black disabled people. Medicalization and pathologization is a major component as to why. It's no different than diagnosing women with hysteria to justify medical intervention and weaponizing medical violence toward women who don't align with patriarchal values. You can't talk about disabled fakers and how complicated and tough the conversation is if you don't also discuss conservatorships and how they're used to oppress and deny disabled people autonomy. You can't talk about it without talking about 5010s, Kendra's Law, and AOTs, and without the broader conversation about how disability is used as a tool of violence by the state. There's no talk about fakers without the ongoing MAID movements, rising in no small part because more and more people are becoming disabled, about do not resuscitate orders and how they disproportionately affect disabled people, or how disposable disabled lives are. Homosexuality was part of DSM diagnostic criteria until 1973. Trans people are also made to undergo autism diagnoses in order to weaponize ableism as a deterrent for gender-affirming care. It's not coincidental. All this is to say that disability does not exist in a neutral state, nor do healthcare workers act as neutral, objective servants of public health. Even without getting into how disabilities are used to pathologize people by the state and institutions, there are also just major disparities in proper diagnoses. This is very much the case if you're talking about any kind of black autistic person, for example. This also shapes the way we talk about allergies. Very recently, a black woman influencer, Dominique Brown, died not just because of a peanut allergy, but because those around her failed to recognize allergies as a serious disability. She died at 34 after attending a box lunch event. 34. She disclosed having an allergy prior to the event, asked again if the food had peanuts in it, and was told no. Even when she instantly felt bad and asked someone to take her to the hospital, she was told no, and to take photos first. This is unacceptable. This is what ableism looks like when allergies are not taken seriously. It's what it looks like when people victim blame her by saying bring your own lunch when she disclosed this fact to them. This is what ableism looks like when people say why didn't she have an EpiPen without the knowledge of the limitations and accessibility challenges of EpiPens. EpiPens are not easily accessible, they don't last forever, and are designed to buy time. The company is at fault, both for serving the food in the first place and to the people who insisted she stay and take photos first. Ableism and fat phobia is saying she looked like she needed to lose the weight anyway. It's victim blaming, that's all it is. And yet, despite all the overwhelming evidence to the contrary, it's continually taken as an unshakable truth that we have to fight back against the out-of-control fakers.
That all of the symptoms of why are so many people getting diagnosed with ADHD in college? As a K-12 person, it's a little bit incredible to me that all of the symptoms of ADHD would go unrecognized in a student's K-12 experience and then suddenly appear in college. And some people have said, well, you know, especially among women, you know, some of the symptoms are different, may not be really on people's radar. And I think there's a truth to that, right? I think there is some legitimacy to diagnosis appearing accurately in college, symptoms appearing in college and then those being recognized. I think that is a real thing. But I think there is also an epidemic of fakery when it comes to these college-age ADHD diagnoses. And there's actually research on this. This 2017 paper estimates the prevalence of faking in ADHD. And this paper gives some interesting detail on how faking can be detected, as well as what the incentives are, like why people would fake an ADHD diagnosis.
I think a lot of you have like a very rosy idea of the ADA and what protections are provided to disabled people. Police regularly shoot deaf people who cannot understand their orders and still get off because they're cops. Not to mention that the ADA is designed to provide loopholes for capitalism at every single turn. If a business can prove that providing an accommodation prohibits their business practices, in many cases, they don't actually have to provide it. That's why people think grandfathering a building is a legal thing. It's not. All a building or an enterprise has to do is say that the cost of providing the accommodation to an employee or even to a customer far outweighs that person's business or that person coming into the store. Like, I think, like, again, you all, so many people have such a romantic view of the ADA, and it's never been enough. And it's also part of the reason why the ADA is so easy to fucking weaponize. Part of Roe v. Wade was challenged by the ADA. They've tried multiple times to shut down polling places in Black and brown neighborhoods using the ADA because people don't pay attention because it doesn't impact them yet. Disability doesn't impact them yet.
Again, this fails to acknowledge that there's an ongoing mass disabling event, and the basis of the argument is it burdens me, instead of recognizing that that means pushing responsibility where it counts then. Manufactured consent and administrative burden go hand in hand, even at the cost of our lives. You cannot have discussion about disability without recognition that killing people instead of resourcing them is the plan. There's one last case I want to show, which is a California Supreme case of Cusiemba v. Victory Woodworks. The court case centered around employer responsibility in protecting its employees and their household members from COVID-19. Robert Cusiemba was infected with C-19 due to his employer knowingly not taking proper protections and precautions, which in turn led to his wife's infection, and she ended up in ICU on a ventilator. The main takeaway was that the case did not favor Robert and noted the potential floodgate of cases that would result from setting it as precedent if employers had a duty to prevent COVID-19 infections. Your health will always be secondary to profit under a capitalist white supremacist society. They will not hesitate to sacrifice your life and then pathologize you if you speak up about it. You're just a hypochondriac or you have anxiety about getting COVID, rather than seeing it as a reasonable reaction to an ongoing pandemic. Media like The Simpsons, like King of the Hill, like South Park need to be called what they are: manufactured consent around ableist ideas that benefit employers and similar institutions. Now, do I think that the writers behind media like this are all feds or being paid off by big businesses to include these things in their works? No, not at all. Though we do need to be mindful that that is very much the case with several people in film and TV, given military propaganda being influenced by government institutions. The reality is that because of a lot of this conditioning, ableism is very rampant, and these sentiments come through with what the authors held in reacting to the real-world cases. The ableism of media like this isn't sold to the character. The problem isn't, I saw Bart Simpson pretend to have Tourette syndrome, so I'm going to go out and do it too. The ableism is sold through the world around the character, a manufactured scenario in which cracking down on disabled people is framed as not only a reasonable solution, but a virtuous form of disability allyship endorsed by the real disabled people. To change this, we have to collectively change how we conceptualize disability in the first place. Treating disabled people like parentheticals is endorsement for the continued inequality and deaths of the community. Nothing about us without us. If you would, consider donating to Hope Relief and Rehabilitation for disability support. They're a Sudanese organization that focuses around disability justice in response to the ongoing genocide in Sudan. If you can't donate, then at the very least I encourage you to follow them and share their link to others who can. Link is in the description. As always, thank you for watching.